Hello, Mason Storm here. On today's episode, we're going to be celebrating New Year's Eve. And what better meal to have for New Year's than a duck? Now, my grandfather, he gave this to me to make. We were always talking about having duck for Christmas, and I guess back in the day, that's all they ever had. He told me that, the first year they had a turkey, he didn't know what a turkey was. So, a completely different time than now, where turkey is kind of the de facto standard. So now we're just going to give our duck a little bit of an inspection, and it looks like a duck, which is good, because that's what we're looking for. Now I was trying to get the neck out of the center here, and I had the thing thawing out all day, but it was still kind of frozen, so I'm not quite able to pull it out, which is kind of unfortunate. Sometimes you can cut off a little bit of this fat, and then it's not so ridiculous when you cook it. Either way, I'm just going to do some score lines in it now. Kind of a diamond pattern, one direction, 45 degrees, parallel to the opposite. And then we kind of score it up. And this lets all the fat kind of come out of it, so it doesn't just turn into a fat bomb in the oven, which is a potential hazard when you're cooking duck. Especially at higher temperatures, the fat in it can kind of splatter a bit, and if that gets on the burner, you can kind of have a little bit of a flare up. So that's just something that you want to avoid. Okay, looks like we got it all checkerboarded up. So now we're going to take our salt and our pepper, and we're just going to give it a light dusting of salt and pepper. Of course, by a light dusting, I mean, a fairly heavy dusting and a firm rubbing. And that will get the salt and the pepper right in there so it doesn't go anywhere crazy on us. Just want to make sure we have good full coverage. Now, because I'm reaching out of a jar like this, I've pre-measured out some of my ingredients, and whatever is left I'm just going to toss. You don't want to have cross-contamination. I don't know if I need to mention that, but, well, whatever. If you're going to do rubs like this, you just want to make sure you either use it all or throw out the rest, because you don't really want to get sick with this stuff. And now that our bird's all ready, we can move on to the next step. Now, for my big pan here, this tray that I have, it's actually a cooling tray. I don't know where the original tray was for this pan. Either way, it's going to be used to hold the bird off of the bottom of the pan and allow the air to get underneath of it, as well as preventing it from kind of cooking in its own juices. So we get that all in there nice and perfect, and we just throw our bird on top. Now, I was going to use the quick method of cooking a turkey, which is you set your oven to 425 degrees, and then you cook it for 45 minutes with the breast side up. Then you take it out and you flip it, you cook it another 45 minutes, then you take it out, you flip it, and you cook it for another 45 minutes. And that's what I started doing at the start, but after my first set of the 45 minutes at the high temperature, it was just bubbling and boiling away like crazy, and I was afraid I was going to have a flare up. And nothing's more embarrassing than having your fire alarm go off at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're cooking a duck. So I flipped it, and then I stuck it back in the oven, but I reduced the temperature to 300 degrees. And this is low enough that it doesn't bubble away or boil away, splatter, and make a big mess. And I've always thought that slow cooking meats like this is usually the best anyway, so I don't know what I was doing, what business I had trying something different, trying a different technique when I already had perfection with what I was doing before. Although what's good about when you do the high temp is that you really get a lot of color on the bird, and it looks quite pretty in this state, minus where the cuts were that I did my diamond pattern. Probably could have went a little bit shallower on there, but it was a little bit cold, so I think that's kind of what screwed me over there. So I'm just going to get out the thermometer now, and what I'm going to do is check it in several different places and make sure we're above 165 degrees Fahrenheit, just to make sure that the bird's all completely cooked. And it's not quite done at this point, so I'm going to throw it back in the oven for another like 40 minutes. The great thing when you cook it at a low temperature, like 300 degrees, is that you can just keep cooking it and it doesn't really ever burn. And it just gets super, super tender. Oh, it's so good. This duck was amazing. So now we're doing our final cooking process. I forgot to take pictures of my second and third time in the oven. Either way, it's done now. Just check in multiple places. And we're going to leave the bird for about 15 minutes before we begin our carving process. And from what you'll see from the carving process, it doesn't really matter what your duck looks like at this point, whether you make it beautiful or not. What matters is the meat and having the meat separated from the bird itself. So I'm just going to start taking off the wings here and the meat that's in the big joint. And we're going to continue on with that. I've always kind of thought it was weird that people would have their meat like as like a carcass on their table. And when you want to eat, you got to like take everything off right then and there. It's like, yeah, it might look a little bit pretty, but it's kind of weird and barbaric. Whereas if you have it all pre-carved, it's like you can just eat. It's just so much better. So what was going on here, I had to peel off the fat. It's such a thick layer of fat around the bird, so you got to peel that off before you can actually even get to the meat. And your fingers are the best tools for telling what's meat and what's not, because you just want to separate the meat from the fat and try to keep it in as good of chunks as you can, and leaving the bones behind. And it's just a matter of feeling and peeling and kind of scraping at the bird. You know, if it feels like meat, it probably is, so just kind of dig at it till it kind of separates, and just work your way around the bird. And the breast has the majority of the meat on it. And you can really see why they moved on to using turkeys instead of ducks for a lot of Christmas dinners and whatnot, because there's just so much more meat on a turkey than there is on a duck. Like the breast is not as pronounced, it's not as big. I mean, yeah, it's a small duck, but even a bigger duck, there's not as much meat on them as there is on like a turkey. And just break all the joints. Got the neck out of it there. Now the neck, I tried taking the meat off the neck a little bit later, and it was just too tough to do anything with, and I was eventually able to separate, and I didn't really like how it tasted. So I might use that for some soup later on, or the bones for making some nice broth. Nothing like the old New Year's duck broth. And just kind of, you know, manhandling it here so that the joints are separated, and then I can kind of pick up the joints and separate the meat from the fat. There's not ever as much meat on the back side of a bird as there is on the front, but if you just keep pulling at it, it's all the little pieces that combine that give you the total amount of meat on the bird. So just take your time and pick at it, and eventually you'll separate the majority of the meat. And then if you want to do a second pass, go through all your meat and stuff again just to separate it. And yeah. So I'm just going to accelerate the video here a little bit more, so hopefully we can see everything kind of in a more reasonable time frame. Now there's a couple ways you do this. I mean, you either separate the meat from the bones, or you separate the bones from the meat. And I think if you separate the bones from the meat, you actually get a higher separation value. You just try to clean every piece of bone up and just take all the meat that's like left on it. And you know, a few minutes. It takes me probably about 20 minutes to you know, get all the meat off of a bird, which I don't think is too bad. But it's something you get better with the more you do, and especially when you start doing different birds and get more experience with different bird types. But turkey is probably the easiest one and has the most meat on it, so it's probably my preferred bird to work with. That, and I have the most experience with it. Okay, now onto our dripping. So I'm going to take that cooling rack out of the big pan, and now I'm going to slide the whole thing out of the way so I can get a pot on the top of the stove, and I'm going to get a strainer out, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to strain the juice into the pot. Now this will get a lot of the juice out of it, but there's still more to be had. So I got a secret technique that I saw in a video a couple weeks back that looked pretty good for extracting more flavorful juices. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take our pan here. We're going to add a little bit of water to it. If you don't want to add water, you can add white wine. I just happen to have water on tap, so that works pretty easy for me. Set our stovetop to medium temperature. And then I'm just going to use the end of a flipper to loosen all the particles that are attached to the pan. And then let this kind of cook down for a little bit. A little bit more water. Yeah, that's probably necessary. And we'll keep going at it. And what we can do when we're done with this is strain this off, and then we have more juices that we can use for making gravy. And a lot of people, they actually make their gravy right in the pan like this, which I've seen a lot of people do. You just kind of cook this down, add a little bit of flour, and you can make your gravy out of this. But I'm not going to be doing that because I'm actually going to be making my gravy tomorrow. But I just wanted to make sure I had as much juices as possible for making my gravy tomorrow, which is actually New Year's when whatever, this is the day before. So now we're just going to dump all that back into that pot we had before through the strainer, and that will give us even more juices for making gravy. If you want to make your gravy right now, go for it. If it's cold, you can add flour to it now, but if your juices are still hot, what you're going to want to do is mix some water with some flour, and then mix that all up, and then add that mixture to it, and then heat it up till it's sizzling away, and then just keep stirring that till it thickens up to what you want. But I'm actually going to be doing something a little bit different, something a little bit experimental right here. So I'm just going to add a little bit of my duck juice fat to the bottom of this pan here. And I'm going to make some of that pan bread that I made yesterday. I have a video for that if you check out yesterday's video. And we'll just dump all that in there in a couple little lumps. And I didn't actually measure anything out this time. I just kind of freehand it, eyeballed it. And I think I got the recipe mostly right. Or right enough that it works. I mean, it's just flour and milk and salt and baking powder. So I'm just going to make my duck patties here, and I'll have them with my duck. But I'm not going to have my actual duck dinner till a later date, with my grandpa and whatnot. So that should be pretty good. And now that looks like we're about done here. I'm just going to fast forward through the rest of this. It's not really the focus of the video, so let me know in the comments below how you like to make your duck. If you like doing that fast technique with the 425, 45, 45, 45, or you like doing more of a slow cook like I did, where I just kind of cook it for a couple hours at 300 degrees and flipping it a few times. Or if you have any suggestions. And if you like my content, would like to see more of it, please like and subscribe, hit the bell. And until next time, stay awesome.